Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about the most important coaches for every team. That is the big team this upcoming year. I have Ohio State, Georgia, Oregon, Alabama, and Texas. So kind of the big boys, at least going into this year. But now let's get to a top 10 Tuesday, and let's talk about the teams under the most pressure for this upcoming year. There will be some overlap here, obviously, with some teams that have the most expectations going into this year, but let's start to break this down. And definitely it's going to be something that we're going to be watching over the next couple of weeks, over the next really the rest of the offseason, see how these teams kind of build up to their 2024. But I think there's going to be a ton of questions. There's going to be a ton of worry about some of these teams, but I have a couple of teams that didn't quite make the list that I want to start with first. I think USC is under a ton of pressure. That defense just has to come along. It has to be better than it was a year ago. I think Michigan with that natty follow-up, I think that's going to be a huge conversation now. I think most Michigan fans are expecting a little bit of a step back from a year ago, but still, you want to be in that national conversation. I had Alabama. Was it just Saban? Is it just Saban, or is Alabama all the same with Kalen DeBoer over in charge over there? So it's going to be fascinating to watch that. And then I had Utah. Are they going to take the throne in the Big 12? Are they going to become the team to beat in the Big 12? But let's jump into the top 10. And I'm starting with Colorado. I understand that Colorado doesn't necessarily have the national title aspirations that some of these other teams do, but Dion wouldn't tell you that. Dion has promised that they are getting into the playoff. He has made that very clear, and Colorado has been abundantly obvious about the fact that they think they should be in the playoff, that they will win the Big 12, that they will do remarkable things this year. So with that comes pressure, and along with that also, when you are coached by Deion Sanders and when you have some of the headlines that Colorado has had over the last couple of years, you're going to have people rooting against you. So miss the mark a little bit, go 7-5, 6-6. There will be people that will be definitely kind of dancing on your graves. Is probably the best way to put it. But let's move on to number 9 here. And I have Florida State. I think when you're coming off a year like they had a year ago, you're obviously going to want to follow up. You're obviously going to want to do the things that you did a year ago, but assert them a little bit more, show that you're here to stay and kind of hang around for a while. But there's tons of question marks around this team. There is a big-time transfer portal class that came in, now a very talented transfer portal class nonetheless, but you're still kind of riding a line there. You're still kind of playing with a little bit of fire when you bring in so many different players and you try to essentially just make it all fit. And I think Mike Norvell can absolutely do that. He's done that in the past and has done an incredible job, but I do think there's going to be a ton of pressure on this team to not be the team that, it was just a blip last year. It was just a mirage that they were able to pull off a 13-0 season. If they take a step back, that's what people will be saying. There's no two ways about that. So it'll be fascinating to watch this team unfold. I think they're one of the more fascinating teams because a lot of people are pointing at them to win the ACC, but the gap between them and Clemson and Miami is not quite as big as some people might think it might be. But let's move on to Georgia. When you wear Georgia, when you wear the block G, when you wear red and black at this point, there's pressure. There's no two ways about that. When you are the best program in the country, there's always going to be pressure on you to perform. That's just the way it is. Kirby Smart is no stranger to this pressure because when he came off a national title, they decided to follow it up with another national title. So I don't necessarily think this is going to be too big of a problem for them to deal with. But there's a ton of pressure on this team. They are set up to do remarkable things this year, probably have the best offense they've had in quite some time, especially with all the weapons they have all over the place. So they're expected to be in the national title at the very least. They're expected to, win the SEC and be in the playoff and dominate a lot of the teams on their schedule. So when you're a Georgia player, pressure just comes with it. That's just kind of the way of things around Athens right now. And then I have Penn State. Penn State is someone that is ready to step into the spotlight. With a 12-team playoff, they are in the playoff pretty much every single year that James Franklin has been the head coach. But there wasn't a 12-team playoff before. Now there is, and now you got to deliver. So Penn State has really, you could make the argument they should be higher on this list because Penn State fans have been waiting way too long for this team to really enter the national conversation, really compete for a national title, and this is the year where it feels like they'll at least get into that conversation. Now, can they kick the door down and really get into that big time conversation of possibly winning a national title? I don't know, but James Franklin has a ton of pressure around him, and it's only increasing. Drew Aller is someone that is probably under as much pressure as anyone around his age probably would be at this point. But when you go to Penn State and you have to compete with Michigan and Ohio State, that's the way of things. So it'll be fascinating to watch them. Ole Miss is another team that I'm watching very closely. This is kind of like another team that we'll get into here shortly, where you bring in a lot of transfers. You have a ton of talent that you didn't have a year ago, especially on the defensive side of the ball. Did a remarkable job addressing a lot of the issues that they've had. But it doesn't mean that all of these guys are going to fit together. We talked about it with Texas. In the SEC, you need 11 guys to fit together. You can't just have a couple making big-time plays and then hope everything falls into place. That's what Ole Miss had a year ago, and it did not work out at all. So I definitely think they've done a great job of addressing all those issues, but it's a different thing from having those players on the roster to making those players do the things that they need to do for you to win an SEC title. And when you talk about Jackson Dart coming back, you talk about Lane Kiffin having all this energy around him at Ole Miss. This feels like the time to strike. This feels like the moment where they can change the narrative around Ole Miss, around Lane Kiffin, around everything around that program, and definitely turn college football on its head. Now, will they do it? That's a big-time question mark, because it's a level of pressure that they have not had to deal with around Ole Miss in quite some time. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. Then we get into the top five, and we got Oregon to start this off. I think Oregon has a ton of pressure. Dan Lanning, going into his third year, did a great job in his first 2 years. There's no two ways about that. Created an incredible team, but you missed the mark by just a little bit those 2 years, and I think people are very, very upset about that around Oregon, especially losing to the team that you lost to in Washington is definitely not what they wanted in that last season. And I think going into this season, they're expecting to compete in the Big 12, or Big 10, excuse me. They're expecting to compete there. They're expecting to get to the playoff. They're expecting to do a lot of these big-time things, and they have to make a step forward to do that. Dan Lanning has to, take a step forward with this team. They have personnel-wise. It's definitely a better team from a personnel perspective than it was a year ago, but again, you got to fit all those guys together and make sure it all works. So it'll be fascinating to watch them unfold. Miami is another team that I'm watching super, super closely. They have pushed their chips to the center of the table. That's just the way of things. They have fully committed to 2024 being the season that sets off all other seasons, that lets them back into the party, that gets them back on the national radar, like 2023 was for Texas and kind of for Florida State, although 2022 was kind of that anyway. But I think Miami, the first 2 years for Mario Cristobal have not necessarily gone the way he wanted to. And I think some people underestimated the rebuild that had to happen around there, because their roster was in really bad shape if you want to be a national contender when he got there. So I tend to think he's kind of on schedule. Now, the reality is you just made the schedule speed up a little bit with some of the people that you brought in, especially Cam Ward from the transfer portal. So they've got to deliver. They've got to be a team that competes for the ACC, that does a ton of really incredible things. And maybe you kick the door down. Maybe you get to the playoff and become a big-time conversation nationally. But as of right now, it's a little bit of a question mark at the best. It's one of those things that you won't believe it till you see it with Miami, kind of. And then you got number 3. I got Texas. I think we can all agree Texas getting back last year to the playoff, getting back in the national conversation is huge. It's huge for that program. It's huge for Steve Sarkisian. But the reality is Texas fans across the country would tell you that that's not what being back is. Being back is not necessarily sticking around for 1 year and then fading back off into oblivion. You got to stick around, and especially going into the SEC, that's going to be a little bit harder. There's some questions about how they'll adapt to the new SEC, how they'll handle the scheduling aspect. You're not just going to have 1 week that's pretty much penciled and win, and then 1 week that is going to be a little bit tougher. Every single week is going to be tough in the SEC, and that's something that Texas is going to have to adapt to, and it's going to be fascinating to watch them. I think Sark and Texas have a chance to totally change the way that people talk about them, especially Sark, because it feels like a lot of people are looking at last season not necessarily as a fluke, but just I think they're looking at it a little bit skeptically, and I think they're kind of waiting for 2024 to confirm one way or another what Texas is, and they definitely want to deliver in 2024, that's for sure. But then let's move on to Clemson. I think we've talked about Clemson a lot. Dabo is steadfast in his beliefs around the transfer portal, around recruiting, around all of the stuff that, makes a college football program. He knows the way he wants to do things, and he's not going to let anyone tell him differently. And I kind of respect that about him. I understand it's not necessarily the way I would go about business, but respect that he is standing on his business and kind of going forward the way that he sees fit. But you got to deliver this year. That's just the reality. If he doesn't deliver this year, some conversations will be had around Clemson. Now, Dabo's not in danger by any means. He's won 2 titles. He's dominated the ACC for quite some time, so he's not in danger of losing that job this year, but he is in danger of having to sacrifice some of his principles and having to dip into the transfer portal and having to do some of the things that he does not want to do. So a ton of pressure on him, because if they deliver, then no one will ask questions. If they don't deliver and continue to take that step back that they have the last couple of years, some questions are going to be had and some conversations might be had, and it might end up with Dabo Swinney not necessarily being the head coach of Clemson in 5 years. But as of right now, he's safe. It's just this year is going to be huge for the future of Clemson. And number one, far and away, it's Ohio State. It's not even close. There is a gap, a gargantuan gap between 1 and 2, because you can't lose to Michigan 3 years in a row. You can't win no Big Ten titles in 3 years. You can't do some of the things that they have done the last 3 years and not have the most pressure in the country. Ohio State is Ohio State. They're going to compete for national titles. They should compete for national titles. The last couple of years, you haven't even really given yourself a shot. Obviously, they had the chance against Georgia. That one didn't go their way, which is yet another bad break for Ryan Day in his career. But the reality is everything's in place. This is the best defense that he has had, Ryan Day, that is, at Ohio State by a wide margin. This is going to be one of the best defenses in the country. The offense is a little bit more worrisome with Will Howard coming in and not really knowing what you have at quarterback, but I think they'll be fine. They have the best running back duo in the country. They have the best wide receiver room in the country. The O-line's going to get a ton better, so I think they'll be okay there. Everything is in place for this team. There is not a thing that is off the table, including winning a national title in truly dominating fashion, rolling through their schedule, doing incredible things, and going down as one of the more dominant programs in the recent history, because this team is just ridiculous. Everything is in place. Everything is all on the table, and Ohio State always has pressure. They're always going to be a team that you expect to see at the top of the mountaintop. You expect to see competing for national titles. But this is different. This is not, we expect you to be there. It's you better be there, or Ryan Day is going to have some very awkward conversations that he has to have. So all of these teams are fascinating to watch. Obviously, there are a ton of different ways you could order these, because a lot of these have different pressures. Maybe some is national title pressures. Maybe some is just compete. But a lot of those teams have just so much going into this year. They've pushed their chips to the center of the table, and some are set up to stick around for quite some time in Georgia and Ohio State. Some maybe not so much. In Miami, maybe Ole Miss are really looking at this year as maybe the year for them. So it's going to be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think when you talk about pressure around teams, it starts with Ohio State. That's the team that you're all going to be watching very, very closely this upcoming year. But there's plenty of other teams that have a lot going into this year. So it's going to be fascinating to watch that unfold, but that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for every content and update you could possibly want. We have incredible people covering every sport you could possibly need and possibly want, so come on over to GSMC and we have you fully covered. But that will do it for what ended up being quite a long show, honestly, but I'll get out of the way for my man Kenneth here. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.